Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into another case.
Always. What are we looking at today?
Well, today's deep dive takes us into the world of corporate turnarounds with an Indian twist. It's, kind of fascinating how often companies find themselves on shaky ground.
I can imagine. The business world is full of unexpected turns.
Right. So we're going to unpack this case of Apollo Polyvinyl Pvt Ltd, a company based in Chennai. And get this, they found themselves in a bit of a financial pickle.
I've heard of them. Weren't they in the news a while back?
They were. And through their story, we'll kind of unravel how the Indian legal system, handles these high-stakes situations. It's kind of like a legal thriller.
Ooh, I like where this is going.
But instead of a detective, we've got the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016.
Ah, the IBC. Now that's a game changer. I'm intrigued.
It gets interesting. Court orders, loan agreements, and a whole lot of rupees on the line.
It's always about the rupees.
Yeah.
So tell me, what's so special about this particular case? What makes it stand out?
What's so captivating about this one is that it gives us, the audience, like a front row seat to how companies, try to navigate these rough financial waters in India.
I see. A real-life case study. So let's set the scene then. Apollo Polyvinyl, what were they all about, and how did they end up in this predicament?
So Apollo Polyvinyl, they were like a lot of companies out there, ambitious, eager to make their mark. They managed to secure two pretty substantial loans back in the early 2010s.
Substantial, huh? How much are we talking?
We're talking serious rupees, over 40 crore in total.
Wow, that's a hefty sum. What were the loans for? Expansion? New ventures?
I'm not entirely sure about the specifics of what they plan to do with all that cash, but what I do know is they put up a lot of collateral to secure those loans, like LLR.
Okay, now that's interesting. What kind of collateral are we talking about here?
We're talking personal guarantees from the directors, talk about putting your money where your mouth is, and even mortgages on properties. They were really going all in.
High risk, high reward, right? But high risk often comes with, well, risks.
And that's where things went a bit south for Apollo Polyvinyl. They ended up defaulting on those loans.
Oh boy. Not just a minor hiccup, I'm guessing.
No, this was a big deal. Their accounts were officially classified as non-performing assets. NPAs, as they're known in the biz.
The dreaded NPA label. A banker's worst nightmare. And I'm guessing this set off a chain reaction.
You bet. When a company gets hit with that NPA label, alarm bells start ringing like crazy, and the lenders, they have to act fast.
Rightfully so. They've got their own stakeholders to answer to. So what did the banks do to recover their money?
They weren't messing around. They pulled out all the stops demand notices, the whole 9 yards. And get this, they even went as far as something called symbolic possession of some of Apollo's assets back in 2019.
Hold on. Symbolic possession. That's a new one. What does that even mean? Did they stage a protest with banners and everything?
Not quite. It's more of a legal maneuver than a dramatic scene, thankfully. It's a way for creditors to assert their control over an asset without actually, physically hauling it away.
I see. More of a legal formality than a repo man showing up with a tow truck.
Exactly. Think of it like a legal notice being slapped on a factory door, for instance.
Ah, I get it. A symbolic gesture with very real legal implications. So things were getting pretty intense for Apollo Polyvinyl. Did they just roll over, or did they try to fight back?
To their credit, they did not go down without a fight. They managed to scrape together some funds to make, like partial payments towards their debts, hoping maybe to appease the banks a bit. They even tried to negotiate a one-time settlement.
A valiant effort. Did it work? Were the banks open to negotiation?
Canara Bank, which was the lead lender, in this case they weren't having it, they saw the situation as more than just a minor bump in the road.
And they were looking for a more permanent solution.
Exactly. And that, my friend, is where our star player, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, makes its grand entrance.
The plot thickens. I knew the IBC would come into play somewhere. Tell me more.
So State Bank of India, which was another lender in the mix, they decided, you know what, enough is enough. They're taking this to the next level. So they filed an application under the IBC to officially initiate those insolvency resolution proceedings against Apollo Polyvinyl.
Wow, talk about escalating things. This wasn't just about recovering some money anymore. It was about determining the fate of the entire company.
You hit the nail on the head. So how did Apollo Polyvinyl respond to this? Did they accept defeat?
Not a chance. They lawyered up, of course. Their legal team tried to poke holes in the application, pointing to some inconsistencies they had found in the official documents. It was a classic delaying tactic, buy some time, try to renegotiate the terms, that sort of thing.
A classic game of legal chess. So what did the National Company Law Tribunal, the NCLT for short, have to say about all of this?
The NCLT, specifically the Chennai bench, reviewed everything with a fine-tooth comb. After much deliberation, they decided to admit the application. They sided with the banks.
Decision time. What made them rule in favor of the banks?
The NCLT, they don't just make these decisions lightly, They look at the cold, hard facts, the letter of the law, all that good stuff. And in this case, the debt was undeniably substantial, way more than enough to trigger those IBC proceedings. Plus, the banks had dotted their I's and crossed their T's. They'd filed the application well within the stipulated time frame.
So legally speaking, the banks were on solid ground. What happened to all those other legal battles that were already underway? Did those just disappear?
That's a beauty of the IBC. It's like the ultimate legal trump card. Once the NCLT admitted that application, all other legal actions against Apollo Polyvinyl were put on pause. They called for a moratorium, giving the company a bit of breathing room from the creditors, you could say.
Okay, let's hit pause for a second, unpack this whole moratorium thing. What does that actually mean for a company like Apollo Polyvinyl? It sounds almost too good to be true.
It's a lifeline, really. It's like a timeout period for a company that's drowning in debt. The moratorium basically prevents those creditors from hounding the company for payments, at least for the time being.
So no more creditors banging on the door demanding their rupees. For now, that must have been a relief for Apollo Polyvinyl, right? But their problems weren't solved, were they? What's next in this legal saga?
Here's where it gets really juicy. With that moratorium in place, the NCLT steps in and appoints a kind of financial referee. They call them the Interim Resolution Professional, or the IRP. And trust me, this IRP becomes a key player in this whole drama.
Ooh, okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about this IRP. Who are they, and what exactly is their role in all of this?
The IRP, they're like the temporary captain brought in to steer the ship until they figure out a long-term solution. And in this case, the NCLT, they brought in a real pro, a guy named Ashok Seshadri, someone with a proven track record in these kinds of situations.
Okay, so what's on the IRP's to-do list? What do they actually do?
Their job is, well, it's multifaceted, to say the least. First things first, they take control of the company's management. They got to make sure those day-to-day operations keep humming along amidst all this chaos.
Makes sense. Can't just let the company crumble while they figure things out. What else is on this financial fixer-upper's plate?
Transparency is key in these situations. Yeah. The IRP has to make a public announcement, let everyone know that the company's in a bit of a bind. Then they have to round up all the creditors, make sure they all come forward and register their claims. It's about getting the full financial picture, a clear snapshot of the company's liabilities, like a financial health check, if you will.
So they're gathering all the pieces of the financial puzzle. Then what?
Then the real work begins. The IRP is responsible for overseeing something called the Corporate Insolvency Resolution Process. It's a mouthful, I know. They call it the CIRP for short.
Catchy.
And it's this intricate set of procedures, all laid out by the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. And the whole goal is to figure out the best possible outcome for everyone involved.
The plot thickens. This IRP, they've got their work cut out for them.
Tell me about it. They're like a financial detective, a strategist, a mediator, all rolled into one.
A tough job, for sure. A lot of responsibility there. They have to, think about the company, the creditors, even the employees. Got to keep everyone happy, or at least try to. High-pressure stuff.
No kidding. So what about Apollo Polyvinyl? Did they find a way out of this mess? Or was it game over?
Believe it or not, they did find a way forward. Though, it wasn't exactly business as usual. Their story actually took a turn we're seeing more and more these days.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. What happened?
Well, the IRP, remember him? He got together with all those creditors, and they started looking for potential lifelines, ways to rescue the company.
So it's not like the goal is to just shut everything down, right?
Exactly. That's the thing about the IBC. It's not about just pulling the plug. It's about seeing if there's a way to salvage a struggling business, give it a fighting chance.
Kind of a restructuring tool then, instead of a death knell. You got it. The IBC recognizes that businesses, just like people, they can hit a rough patch. Sometimes all they need is a little restructuring, a fresh perspective, maybe a new leader at the helm.
Speaking of new leaders, remind me again, who ended up taking over Apollo Polyvinyl?
Ah, right. It was Kleena Industries, Private Limited. They were the ones who saw potential in Apollo. despite all the trouble. They presented a resolution plan that everyone seemed to like, at least enough.
Okay, so a new company swoops in, takes over operations. Is that really a rescue, though? It sounds like the old Apollo Polyvinyl is, well, gone.
That's a good question, and it gets to the heart of what a successful turnaround really means. Sometimes, survival means evolving, changing, even being absorbed by someone stronger.
So not necessarily about the original company staying exactly the same, but more about finding a solution that works, that benefits everyone involved.
Right. Creditors, employees, everyone. Because the alternative, liquidation, that's a whole different story.
And not a happy one, I'm guessing.
Not at all. Liquidation is like the nuclear option, dismantling the whole company, selling off the scraps. Not pretty. At least with Cleena stepping in, there's a chance for some continuity, jobs saved, maybe even a bit of the company's legacy living on.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the legal back and forth, the financial wheeling and dealing. But what about the people, the ones who actually worked for a polyvinyl? What happened to them?
It's something people ask a lot, and you're right, those official documents, they don't always paint the full picture. It's important to remember that the IBC isn't just about numbers, legalities. It's about livelihoods, people's lives.
So there are protections in place for employees.
For sure. That moratorium we talked about, that's a big one for employees.
Yeah.
It prevents things from shutting down overnight. No one wants to see people out of work because of a technicality.
Right, the moratorium buys them some time, but what about the long run?
That's where that resolution plan comes in. It can, and often does, include specific provisions to protect those employees.
And that kind of protections.
Well, the new owners, they might have to keep a certain percentage of the workforce, for example, or offer severance packages to those who are let go. It's about making the transition, as smooth as possible.
So the IBC tries to look out for the employees too, not just the big players.
It's a balancing act for sure. It's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. It's a process that recognizes how complicated these situations can be.
Absolutely. It's been eye-opening, this whole deep dive. I mean, who knew there was so much to unpack about corporate restructuring? It's not just spreadsheets and legal jargon. It's about real people and real consequences.
You're telling me every decision has a ripple effect.
Okay, before we move on, there's one thing I'm still wondering about. Cleena Industries, when they came in with their resolution plan, the creditors didn't get all their money back, did they? I mean, that's a lot of rupees we're talking about.
You're right, they didn't. It's this concept they call a haircut in finance.
A haircut. That sounds ominous.
It can be. Basically, creditors, they often have to accept less than what they're owed as part of the deal. It's a compromise, a way for the company to get a fresh start, but it comes at a cost.
So how much of a haircut did those creditors have to take in this case?
The secured creditors, mainly the banks, they got about 26.75% of what they were owed.
Wow. That's a big chunk of change to just write off. What about the other types of creditors, the ones who, I don't know, supplied materials or services to a polyvinyl? Did they get the same deal?
Sadly, no. Operational creditors, the ones you're talking about, they usually get even less. They're lower down on the totem pole, so to speak.
So there's a hierarchy even among creditors.
You could say that. The thinking is secured creditors, like those big banks, they usually have collateral, something to fall back on. The operational creditors, they don't have that same safety net.
I guess it makes sense, but it still feels a little unfair, doesn't it? Like the little guy always gets the short end of the stick.
There's definitely a debate about that, about how to make things more equitable. Some folks argue that the system favors those bigger players, and we need to do more to protect the smaller businesses, the ones operating on thinner margins.
Right. It's all about finding that balance, isn't it? Risk versus reward, fairness versus practicality.
Exactly. And that's what makes these cases so interesting to analyze. It's never black and white.
So much gray area. Okay, we've talked about the banks, the suppliers. What about the people who are actually running Apollo Polyvinyl? The ones who, steered the ship into these rocky waters in the first place. What happens to them after a takeover?
The IBC is pretty clear on that point. Once that resolution plan is in motion, the old guard, the promoters, they're essentially shown the door. They lose their stake in the company and usually have no claim to any of the proceeds.
Or clean break then.
Pretty much. It's a fresh start for the company and a hard lesson for the former management.
Accountability. I like it. We've covered a lot today. From those initial loan agreements to that final resolution, it's been quite a ride.
Tell me about it. A crash course in the world of corporate insolvency. But hey, that's what we're here for, right?
To boldly go where no podcast has gone before. Now, before we get to our final thoughts, I have one more burning question. What about our friend Ashok Seshadri, the IRP? What happens to him after Kleena Industries takes over? Does he just, like, disappear into the sunset?
Huh. Good question. It highlights another interesting aspect of the IBC. Once the company is back on track, the IRP's job is done. They hand over the reins and move on to the next case.
So they're like a specialized consultant, a temporary fix-it person.
That's a great way to put it. They swoop in, stabilize the situation, gather the intel, then they're off to the next challenge. Always in demand, those IRPs.
It's kind of like calling in a financial SWAT team when things go haywire. They come in, assess the damage, help stabilize the situation, and then they're off to the next crisis.
That's a great analogy. It's a fascinating system, this whole IBC thing. But like anything new, I imagine it has its share of hiccups, right?
Oh, absolutely. The IBC, well, it's still a work in progress, let's say. There are definitely areas where it could be, streamlined or tweaked to make it even more effective.
So what are some of the biggest criticisms? What are people saying?
One of the most common complaints is honestly the complexity of it all. It can be, well, a bit of a legal jungle, to put it mildly. Multiple stages, tons of paperwork, a whole cast of characters involved. It can be a lot to handle, especially for smaller businesses.
So it's supposed to be a lifeline, but the process itself can be a bit of a headache.
Kind of, yeah. And that's something policymakers are always looking at, how to, simplify things without making it any less fair or transparent.
Right, because fairness is key. And what about this whole haircut thing? The fact that creditors often have to take a loss. Doesn't that make lenders a bit wary of, doing business with companies that might be considered risky?
It's a valid concern. I mean, if you knew you might not get all your money back, wouldn't you think twice about lending in the first place? It's all about managing risk.
Exactly. And that's the tightrope they're walking with this whole thing. On one hand, if the haircuts are too big, it could scare away those lenders, make them think twice about giving loans, especially to smaller businesses, the startups, the ones that are inherently a bit riskier.
So it's about striking that balance, right? Giving the company a fighting chance without scaring off potential investors.
Exactly. It's got to be enough of a lifeline to make a difference, but not so much that it throws the whole system out of whack.
We've talked a lot about the NCLT, the court's role in all this. They have the final say, don't they? A lot of power there.
For sure. The NCLT, they're the ones calling the shots. They decide who gets admitted for this whole resolution process, whether the plan's any good, even if a company has to go belly up and liquidate. Big decisions.
So they better be squeaky clean, right?
100%. The whole system hinges on trust. If people think the NCLT is playing favorites, the whole thing falls apart.
It's been quite the deep dive, exploring this whole world of corporate turnarounds in the IBC. We've gone from loan agreements to courtrooms to financial restructuring, all in under an hour.
We've covered a lot of ground. It really shows you how complex this world is, how everything's connected, and how even small decisions can have huge ripple effects.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up, is there one big takeaway, something that really resonated with you as we were going through all of this?
For me, it's how Polyvinyl's story really highlights how India's handling of corporate insolvency is changing, evolving.
Yeah.
The IBC, it represents a real shift in thinking. It's less about, punishing failure and more about giving viable businesses a chance to bounce back.
The more optimistic outlook, right? It's not always the end of the road.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even when things go wrong, there might be a way to salvage something, to find a path forward.
A message of hope for struggling companies out there. Now, before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've spent all this time, digging into Polyvinyl's financial ups and downs, the legal ins and outs, but I think it's important to remember the human side of all of this.
Couldn't agree more. It's easy to get lost in the weeds and forget about the people involved.
Right, because behind all these balance sheets, all these legal documents, there are real people with real families, real dreams, people whose lives are directly affected by these big corporate decisions, employees who rely on these companies, families whose financial security is tied to a company's success. It's a good reminder that business decisions, they have a ripple effect. They reach far beyond the boardroom.
Absolutely. It's a perspective we should all keep in mind.
And on that note, that's a wrap on another deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those perspectives open.